You're watching Face to Face. I'm your host, Tim Vince. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. David Landrum, who is an author and an advocate. And David, our title today is From Bootle to Westminster. And I'd really like to talk about the story or your journey from Bootle to Westminster. And I don't know where to start, but I'm really interested in, where you got your doctorate and what is the passion that drives you today, and I'm sure the two are connected.
Well, I come from Bootle in North Liverpool. I was born in Bootle, raised in Bootle, my family are from Bootle.
Is it correct to say, all right, how are you?
Yeah, but not like that.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I get lots of friends doing these terrible Scouse accents, but you are forgiven for that one. But yeah, that's where I come from. I've still got my accent, even though I've lived in the south for 25 years or something now. And grew up in Bootle in a normal childhood. Got into some trouble along the way, and left school without any qualifications and was a builder in the building trade. I was working in various places, and when I was working in Germany, I was doing building work over there. My wife came to faith, and I came back from Germany and went to church with her, and to my great surprise, met with the living God.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. I should really talk about that, but I want to focus a little bit more on Liverpool. And were you there when they had the Toxteth riots?
Yeah.
I was there just afterwards, and it's a beautiful area, a historic Georgian area, and it was all smashed up. What effect did that have?
I left school in this sort of deindustrialised sort of unemployment time in Liverpool. It was really awful. There was terrible unemployment. I think half the population of the city left, half. And I remember working in Toxteth as a young lad in the building trade while the riots were happening, and driving down Upper Parliament Street, and the road was on fire from petrol bombs the next day, and there was rubble and carnage and buildings burning everywhere. It was it was a boiling point in many ways, and a turning point for the city, because the city has regenerated incredibly since that time. I think it's the biggest tourist attraction city now outside of London in the UK, and it's because
they developed
a remarkable story.
Developed the docks. Of course, they had the dockers' strikes, during the Thatcher era. Yeah. Then you had Derek Hatton and the militant tendency, as they used to call them. So you were there.
I was there through all them turbulent years, all the difficult years. Yeah, it was a very, very difficult time to live in Liverpool. A lot of crime, a lot of trouble, a lot of suffering and poverty as well.
Yeah. So I can't remember that it's a long title, your PhD, but I think it has citizenship in there, so we might unpack that. But tell me what. It's a bit like Clamfer Goch or Goch.
It is. It's not worth reciting the full title, I don't think. But it focused. So when I come to faith, the Lord drew me. I left school without any qualifications, and He drew me into education. And in short order, I was doing a PhD through Lancaster University at Edge Hill University College, which focused on citizenship, the idea of citizenship, how you teach citizenship, and citizenship is basically the relationship between the powers and the people, the state and the individual. And it's really, really important, and it's actually important in the Bible. So the Bible is full of explicit references to citizenship. Paul talks about citizenship a lot, and then we have the great thinkers like Augustine who unpack that, and it's really important for us.
So is the heart of it freedom? Some within boundaries, but we talk about the Judeo-Christian civilization. Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, freedom and justice as well. God is calling us to demonstrate and display the signs of His kingdom before His return, for His glory and for our healing, and also to secure the freedoms for the gospel. We forget there are many people around the world who do not have the freedom to just communicate with another human being about Jesus, to just tell them the gospel. So it's really important, actually, that them freedoms, they're fundamental to everything else, all the other freedoms we have. So Yeah.
And it, so it's very, you're talking about the curriculum, so I assume you're talking about the, state school curriculum, and how it's taught, how's it going, sort of thing. Because I look at it from my perspective involved with Christian education, it seems a real challenge for parents. I'm sure you've had a great influence on the teaching of citizenship, but the actual outworking as a whole of our education system, it seems as though it's sort of wobbling.
Well, the challenge you have with education is it is just that, it's a system. And whoever has the political control of the system can influence the values and the ideas that are taught within that system. And there are lots of amazing people doing amazing work in the state sector, teachers and lecturers. But there are dominant ideas within that system that are distinctly anti-Christian, and we've seen these being challenged in Parliament recently, which is good. It's good to see that, But we do not have the Christian values that we would like to see within our national curriculum and within our school system, as was 50 years ago. It's very much changed.
I'm fairly simplistic, so I look at things like the Lord's Prayer. I mean, I grew up, where we had a set of Christian assemblies, and, we would have the Lord's Prayer. It wasn't an overtly Christian school, but it seemed to be part and parcel of the framework that we grew up in.
Well, that's important, because what people have forgotten is that education is formation. There's no such thing as a values-free education. You can't just teach mathematics and English, and you have to teach it within a framework of values. And for centuries within the UK, as the education system's developed, it's been the Judeo-Christian framework that's given us that scaffolding, if you like. We don't have that scaffolding anymore. We have it in certain schools and in certain places, but generally speaking, we don't have it. And we have a more secular and more relativistic scaffolding now, if it is a scaffolding at all.
And they talk about, the object of education is to prepare children to be, let's say, citizens in the modern Britain, and to sort of be part of the economy, as it were. It's as though that's the focus, that you've got to make money and you've got to be part of an economic cog, and that's, we've got to be like China, and and we're all basically little cogs in some big economic machine.
Well, the problem is, we're either shaped by the state or the market. They're the two great forces through education in our society at the moment. So the education system exists, really, you're right, to churn people out who are either consumer units, there to consume things, or regulatory units there to basically be regulated by the state. And them two forces are really dominant in the absence of a Judeo-Christian framework, which talks more about interpersonal values, about forgiveness and about caring for each other, etc., etc.
And the bigger framework, and then we'll expand into other areas, but education means a lot to me, and think about what's the legacy for the next generation that we're leaving for them. There's a lot we could talk about there. But another simple observation is it's absolutely forbidden to talk about creation. So the big framework is, you're saying that Judeo-Christian has been eroded, but taking out that central plank of, which I think is part of the Christian gospel, is that God created us. We're accountable to him. He's transcendent, someone higher than us. There's a moral framework that he's created. That's out.
Well, you have a relativistic way of seeing the world now that's mediated through education. So many years ago, when I was in university, we'd talk about postmodernism and the postmodern term, which is relativism. And it was a kind of academic pursuit at that time, but it's come through the universities, and it's now in our society and in our education system and in politics as well. And education is the perfect example of it. So we get relativistic views of what it means to be human. We used to have a biblical anthropology, so I had an obligation to give you dignity and respect because you're made in the image of God. Well, what do you do if that's gone? What do you replace that with? And I don't think the secular kind of worldview has figured out what that is. So it basically boils down to your identity in relation to possibly your sexuality or your political preferences, and what you end up with is a a kind of battle of all against all for supremacy or even victimhood, because victims, they get more rights than non-victims in this context.
When we first met, you wouldn't have even remembered me because you were buried in a desk in the off-parliamentary office of Jim Dobbins. So we haven't spoken much about Bootle, but we're now moving quickly to Westminster. You were working with a fine Labour MP, Jim Dobbins. I think he was the MP for Rochdale or Hayward and Middleton. Just tell me about what you were doing there. Was that directly after you had finished your PhD, or?
No, I finished my PhD. I'd done some lecturing and some research, and then went to work for Bible societies to do Bible advocacy in Parliament as part of influencing the political culture with the value and the frameworks of the value. And our political culture is very much derives from the values of the Bible. And Jim was part of the all-party Christian group, so I was based in his office. He gave me some space to be able to do that work within Parliament, and it was just such an honour to be working alongside Jim and in all sorts of things.
I remember speaking. It was. I think if it's the same all-party, it was called the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Families and Child Protection or something like that, but that was something else. But anyway, I remember meeting my local MP, who was Laura Sands, and she said, "Hi, Tim," because I'd only known her down in South Thanet. "Hi, Tim, what are you doing here?" And she said, and I said, "Well, I'm here to speak at this, group on family and child protection." She said, "Oh, that's a contradiction." And so I suddenly realised that what I thought was just an absolute given, like the Lord's Prayer, people from another perspective saw that the family was a place where kids were in danger.
And there we are back to the postmodern turn coming through the universities and going into politics. We used to call this phenomenon extremists in suits. So 40, 50 years ago, people who would have been laughed out the room, and rightly so, for their ideas, have learned to wear suits and put ties on and sound sensible, but their ideas are extreme. They're very extreme about what it means to be human and the relationships that we have, family relationships, the things we take for granted and we hold as goods in our society now, they're all being challenged.
Yeah. And I've spoken to you on different occasions because of you've got a global reach in what you do, and there is an issue with the West that it seems to have lost confidence in this heritage that we're sort of talking about. And I'm not sure where it's going to lead.
Well, I'm not sure where it's going to lead. I mean, in my current role with Open Doors, we don't focus on secular issues because until and unless we see countries in the West coming onto our world watch list, I mean, we focus on the most persecuted in the world. Yeah. But the trajectory is quite clear to many people in the West that we're heading, as we head away from Christian values, we're heading against Christian values. So, nature abhors a vacuum. What is filling the gap left by Judeo-Christian morality in our society? And there's a whole range of different things that are filling the gap, and they don't work. And they're being seen to not work right now, but that's where we are. That's the point we're at history. So it is an interesting time to be alive. I think we've got a whole more trouble to go through before we see some improvements, hopefully. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to push it a bit further because the Islamic world tends to still be quite secure in what they stand for. Of course, they've got their little divisions, theological traditions, and there's also enmity between different factions within Islam. But their view of the West is that we're weak, that even Christendom is decadent. And it sort of seems to be emboldening them. Have they got a case there? Is there something?
I think they have got a case. It's not just the Islamic world, it's other religions and even other ideologies around the world. They associate, because of the history, Christianity with being Western. And one of our challenges is to make a distinction between the two. Because Christianity at heart is a Middle Eastern religion that is now overwhelmingly non-Western to the degree that it will never be a majority white religion ever again. It's impossible mathematically. And it is the most multi-ethnic, multilingual religion there's ever been, and is growing fast. So, praise God. So we need to make that case, because as Western values become more and more discredited or devalued, if I can use that with values, we need to say, well, that's not Christianity. And I think, I think some other people from other religions are beginning to understand that distinction.
So I want to just mention one more time, Jim Dobbins, he was a Catholic, you're an evangelical, as it were, but you found that there was something that's in common, there were common causes that we both hold to, which is part of our Christian world.
Absolutely, and I do think as well, you have to ask the question in the cultural context that we're in of non-Christian, anti-Christian challenges. At what point do we put aside our denominational differences and unite in defense of the gospel and the faith itself? And I've got many friends who are Catholics from across a whole range of different parts of the Christian faith. And you're beginning to see right now, so to be a Christian in our own culture comes with a cost. That may not be a bad thing, We've gone from being at the centre to being a minority at the margins, and that historically is where the church has always been the most powerful. So it's good that it comes with a cost, because the wheat is being sorted from the chaff, as it were. And I think that refining of the church is going to continue for some years yet.
And, of course, as evangelicals, we say, right, we will take as our primary authority God's word. But, it's sort of, there's plenty of evangelicals who don't even do that now.
True, and there's plenty of Catholics who take the Bible very seriously. Indeed. So it's a spiritual thing, isn't it, really? The Bible says, we're one body, one spirit, and you find you've either got that or you haven't. I remember a church leader many years ago saying to me, never try and build unity. Never try and build unity. Just try and build on it, because you've either got it spiritually or you haven't.
Very good.
And that's a fascinating way, I think, of looking at things with the church.
And disunity comes when folks are selective. So they'll find their narrative in the Bible. It doesn't matter whether it's even a secular cause, as it were, or a faction within Christendom. And there's a great danger there, isn't there?
There is a great danger, and the great challenges that will come against authentic Christianity, authentic historic mainstream, orthodox Christianity theologically in the future will come from the secular state being legitimized by apostate Christianity. That's where the challenges are going to come from, and I think we see a little bit of that already.
That is something. Could we look a little, I mentioned creation, but on the fact that the Bible is being discredited, by science, and there seems to be this divergence, whereas a couple of hundred years ago, all the great scientists, believed in the Bible and, were motivated by the fact that, God had created us, so and He created a world of order, so we must be able to discover that order so we can start measuring things, and that seemed to form the basis of scientific endeavour, whereas today, science is all about, other things.
Well, it's a myth, though, is it not, that science and Christianity are incompatible? Because historically, like you say, you could even argue that science, as we understand it, is a product of Christianity. It's the inquiring mind. It's a exploration of the wonder of creation, which is an absolutely amazing thing. And like you say, many scientists were Christians. And the recent head of the Human Genome Project is a Christian. The head of cosmology at John Polkinghorne, when he was at Oxford, he was an Anglican vicar. So that still continues today, and I just think we need to puncture these myths as much as possible. Science, though, science doesn't give us moral answers to things. It tells us about what is. It doesn't say about what ought.
Yeah.
And I think that's the distinction we need to maintain with science and religion.
Now, I want to bring it back to Westminster, and the reason I'm sort of giving all of this sort of background sort of splashing of paint is because these are at the heart of the debate. What is the Christian cause in Westminster? What are we standing for? And then whether it's possible to change things, I don't know, in a very pluralistic, secular, legislature.
I think my experience is that even though the secular kind of worldview is dominant at this time and is smashing many of our institutions and like the family, like social relationships, etc., etc., it's corrupting and subverting them.
And threatening the church.
And threatening the church as well. The church that stands against that.
Yeah.
There is, in the general population, I discern, a real unease with the direction of travel for our society, like there's not been before. So, where I live, in my little village where I live, if you go in the local pub and if you just listen to the conversations, when somebody somewhere mentions transgenderism or gender fluidity or something, it's usually accompanied by a barrage of expletives. And people are genuinely perplexed and upset by these issues. They're upset because they threaten the crown jewels of our lives. These are our families, these are our children, to try and erase mother and father, brother and sister, these sort of gendered labels. These are the most precious things in our lives. And I think that for that reason, this entire project is doomed in many ways. And we have many secular commentators now critiquing what's happening in the direction it's going in. So we live in a strange moment. It's kind of, secularism is all at once powerful but very vulnerable and exposed at the same time. It's a paradox, really.
Yeah, and a real disconnect between Westminster and Bootle, as it were, or Westminster and the man on the street or in the pub. Just they've done a real job, a real number on our country.
Absolutely. So there's been a lot written about the complete disconnect from those who are elected in our main parties and the way ordinary people live their lives and have their values. I was talking only this week to a friend of mine who's an MP who's stepping down at the next general election because he's just had enough. He went into, he's a Labour MP, he's a great guy, he's a real thinker, and he went into politics.
And he's not an evangelical.
No, he's not an evangelical at all. He comes from a Catholic background, and his faith is growing, shall we say, but he come into politics because he had a heart to help the poor, and he wanted to be in a place where he was helping working people and their families, and he's got to a point where he can no longer be part of where he is. And it breaks his heart. He's really heavy-hearted about this, but that's happening across all the different parties. So you have a Conservative Party that doesn't really conserve anything. You have a Labour Party that doesn't really represent working people's views and values anymore. And you have a Liberal Party that's, well, distinctly a liberal. Look at what happened to Tim Farron. So there is a significant disconnect from people's lives at this moment, and I wonder what will happen over the next decade, whether there will be a realignment or whether there will be a complete disintegration of our political culture.
Wow. Because they call them representatives. It's not the House of Representatives like in the States, but they're supposed to be MPs, members of Parliament for a constituency, but it seems that, let's say you're from the north, my mum was from the north, they don't seem to be represented.
It's such a mixed bag. MPs are very different one from another, and even across the party. So some MPs are fantastic constituency MPs. They genuinely live for their constituents and they work hours that we wouldn't believe. They live and breathe it, and we need these people. There are others who are more ideologically driven, that their ideas don't work, but they'll still pursue them to the bitter end anyway. So it's a mixed bag, really. There are some wonderful MPs, but there is undoubtedly a cognitive, a psychological disconnect between our political classes, if I can put it like that, and the people.
Yeah. So just in the last couple of minutes, give us some little hopeful message that we can hold on to. Are there signs within our country and our politics where you can see, right, there's a hope here, there's light at the end of the tunnel?
I'm hopeful in the sense that people thought that Christianity would just fade away in the secular century, the last century. It hasn't. Globally, it's growing exponentially in many places around the world.
And not through conquest and sort of convert or die.
No, it's growing through the gospel, the power of the gospel. And people's lives are being redeemed everywhere, and in the UK. And even though we're seeing the fading of cultural Christianity, we are seeing the light glowing brighter of what I would call, well, what William Wilberforce calls real Christianity. Wilberforce many years ago wrote a fantastic booklet with a long title, and it was this title: A Practical View of the Prevailing Religious System of Professed Christians in this Country as Contrasted with Real Christianity. There you go. It's a very long title, but it was true then, and it's true now, that God is refining his bride. And that gives me great hope, because if he wasn't doing that, well, we would be in real trouble. It does mean that there's lots of testings ahead, and to call yourself a follower of Jesus will involve incurring a cost. But as I say, that's not a bad thing in the long term, I don't think.
Fantastic, David. That was a stroke of genius to mention William Wilberforce, and that's given me great hope. Thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Face to Face, and just look out for the next William Wilberforce, and it might be you. So join us when we next go face to face.